another hometown history episode. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Dami.
Tonight's episode is on the Children's Home of York. Our title is Children's Home at 160 from Orphanage to Multi-Service, York County Care Provider. We are actually at Troy, which is in Pelham, and is a beautiful campus. We encourage you guys to drive past. We're also very close to the Shoe House. There's a lot of cool things happening over here in the east part of town.
Yeah. So we always start with our agenda. So first we're going to start talking about the origin story of the Children's Home, making sure to include stories of children who were actually there. And then we're going to discuss other social institutions like the almshouse and the hospital. And remember, we're going to finish with the reform changes to the Children's Home over time. So we're going to focus a lot on the history, and you'll hear things today that might seem odd. We're going to talk about segregation and indentured servitude, but it's important to note that these practices are no longer used today. So listen until the end for how the Children's Home of York changed with the times.
We want you to walk away with takeaways, important lessons that you can learn from our history presentation for tonight. We've got 3 of them. One is that the Children's Home of York was one of the earliest institutions that supported children that were experiencing some of the hardest challenges that they will ever face in their life, and that is being raised without parents. Although many of the people watching this in York County are not going to encounter social institutions today, the most vulnerable people in our population, like children, like the poor, like the unhealthy, rely on social institutions like the Children's Home of York to survive. And frankly, if we have supports like that, it makes our entire community healthier and happier. And finally, if it wasn't for philanthropists, if it wasn't for people in our community, local foundations, and volunteers, nonprofits like this wouldn't be able to function. So everyone out there that volunteers or gives to a nonprofit, thank you. They are the reasons why we can have social services like this today.
Yeah, so the founding of the Children's Home of York dates back to the Civil War, my favorite time period. So around 5,300 York Countyans served during the Civil War, so that's about 8% of the population. So about 510 known men died and 640 were wounded during the war. So if you're keeping track, that means that 20% of those that served were either killed or badly hurt. And that doesn't account for the cases of PTSD, or back then it would have been known as shell shock, or the other mental illnesses that happened as a result of serving in the war.
And these are just York County numbers. That's not even Civil War numbers, obviously, as far as the nation is concerned.
Right.
So when I think of the Civil War, I picture things like this. I stole this from Dami's Facebook, the 87th.
Yeah.
She's a reenactor, if you didn't know.
I was looking for me. I was like, who am I?
So I think of this. When I think of the Civil War, I think of the Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln freeing millions of African Americans from servitude.
Yeah.
I don't usually think of orphans.
Right.
I don't think of what happens after. So we had all these men go out and they served. Some of them didn't come home. And at the time, women, not many of them anyway, were equipped to support an entire family.
Right.
And so a lot of children found themselves orphaned at the time.
Yeah, and there was a married couple who saw this loss of life, and they actually did something about it. So their names were Isabel and Samuel Small, and they, along with a group of more than 70 others, met in November of 1864 at a church. And at this historic meeting, it resulted in a private nonprofit called the Children's Home of the Borough and County of York.
Long name.
Yeah, so I like Children's Home of York a little bit better. And it was guided by a board of trustees that had 16 men and a board of managers with 24 women.
Pretty established for the 1860s.
And I like that there was more women in charge than men.
And women didn't even have the right to vote yet.
I know.
Right? I just think that's fantastic.
Quite the juxtaposition.
So the purpose of the first Children's Home of York was to educate and provide asylum for all poor white orphans or half orphans under the age of 12. Destitute children were admitted under special circumstances like vagrancy, exposure, neglect, or abandonment. They could also join. And we'll discuss this later on in the episode as well. So in under 2 months after its incorporation, the trustees and managers began accepting children into a rented house in East York. And at first, it was capable of housing 30 kids at first.
Yeah, so you have to remember that this ran on volunteers. So you want to think about, what are you doing to volunteer your time when you're not working for an income?
Yeah. What do you do?
Well,
where do you get started? Let's this drops down.
Preserving the history of Newberrytown, Lewisburg area history lovers group, the DAR, the library.
Why don't you, just for a second, you started this history group that now has more followers than there are people in Newberrytown.
Yes.
And you volunteer your time to create this community.
Yes.
Why?
I just get a lot of joy out of it. I like preserving the history for generations to come, like we're doing with Hometown History.
And this girl's on her phone checking things. And again, don't get me wrong, when Dami and I hang out, I have her full attention. But she's also
chronically
attentive on Facebook and posting lots of stuff.
Gotta moderate my page.
So here is what the original children's home of York looked like. It was built in 1867, just 2 years after the Civil War had ended. It was a large, big brick building, and it was on land that was donated by the Smalls. So yay, again, for the Smalls. The original location is not where we're at today. It was not on Shoe House Lane. There. So there is a map of where it was originally. So you can see that it is on the southeast corner of North Pine and East Philadelphia Street. So you can, I've driven past this a million times, didn't realize that this was the original location. At the time, it had 19 girls and 17 boys, and a total of 25 of them were orphans specifically from the Civil War.
Wow, so they lived really highly structured lives at the children's home with a regimented schedule. And since the home largely ran on donations, they were surrounded by only the most frugal of furniture, bedding, and clothes. So the uniformity meant that they wiped away any individuality with the kids. And for example, the barber didn't give you a choice on what type of haircut you got. So I'm picturing military style, cropped haircuts.
Yeah. A bowl cut.
Probably. Yeah, and the clothing, it might have covered their skin, but it was really dreary and drab. So in the minds of the people running the home, though, they thought that this institutional life worked. And in a sense it did, because you needed to run things very structured.
Yeah. And even, think about the Victorian era, children were supposed to be seen and not heard. The concept of childhood and enriching their experiences, that concept is new. That didn't exist 160 years ago when the children's home was formed. So this was not abnormal for the time. Again, we want to focus on this is the past. When we get to today, stay to the end, you'll hear that this is not at all how it is today.
Right.
So, here is a picture then. You can see some of the original
those
kids.
bowl cuts.
Oh man, I have a 2-year-old and he will not sit still for a haircut.
I believe it.
And my mom she did such a good job.
Just straight across.
He looks like the guy on Dumb and Dumber. But it's almost so bad it's cute.
Jim Carrey.
Yeah, so it kind of reminds me of some of them in here.
Jim Carrey, if you're watching, call us.
So here are some of the numbers from 1875. This was, again, about 10 years after the Civil War had ended. At the time, there were 57 children that lived there. A total of 145 had passed through the doors. And at the time of those 57 children, 31 of them were still orphaned as a result of the war. And at this time, the mission and scope of Troy had also expanded, so it broadened its scope to include any children who lost their parents, not just Civil War.
Right. So now we're going to jump ahead a few decades, and we're going to tell you a story about a girl who found herself at the children's home. So Ara Marguerite Starner was just 2 years old when she came to the home. And it was 1929 and her mother could no longer take care of her. So her mom's failing health meant that there were reduced wages, and then dad had abandoned the family, unfortunately. So she didn't know it then, but she ended up living at the Children's Home of York until she was 18 years old.
Yeah. She described it as a loving and positive environment, and this is largely thanks to a woman that took care of her.
Yeah.
That woman's name was Mary Sittler Cooper, and she was better known as Aunt Mame. She started working there in the 19-teens, and then she later directed it for 45 years.
Wow.
Legacy position right there. Era remembered playing a lot by sledding down hills in the snow. She also would ride bikes out in the grass, and then in the large room that they had, they would get out roller skates and they would roller skate.
Oh, fun. And they also indulged in the arts a little bit. So they put on performances in the auditorium like Snow White and Cinderella. And the year before Ara came, they built a swimming pool. So that's always a huge plus for the kids. And by this time, they had painted the walls with cheerful colors. So locals ended up bringing in their donkeys with carts to carry them around. And I'm sure it was, you know.
I would have had a great time.
Yeah.
I would have loved that. So in the evenings, the children would assemble themselves in a big room and they would sit down and have dinner together. The tables varied in size and they were draped in tablecloths and they were set with cloth napkins. So they taught them a lot of dinner etiquette. Jim McClure pointed out in a conversation or in an article that he wrote that conversation was discouraged. They did not encourage the kids to talk. And that's interesting because it probably was intended to calm down rowdy kids who were more focused on having fun than they were on consuming their vegetables. And if they didn't eat their meal at the time, they were mandated to sit there until the next meal.
Ooh.
That's a harsh punishment.
That's very harsh. Usually it's just go to your room,
right,
you know,
without
get
dinner.
breakfast.
Yeah.
But today, I mean, I feel like you have to pull teeth to get your kid to talk to you at dinner. For a lot of York Countyans, the only time you're really with your whole family sitting down having conversations is at the dinner table.
Right.
What do you guys talk to Otto about? I know he's only 2.
I know. He's just babbling at this point. My husband and I, we don't do this every time, but I like to do a high and a low of the day.
Okay.
Like what was your high, of what that was really positive, and then what was your low. Ours is usually not at dinner time, it's before we go to bed.
Okay.
It's like kind of like our check-in, like brushing our teeth together, and it's like, what'd you do today? And, just kind of connect that way.
Sure.
So the kids at the home, again, 160 years ago, were no strangers to punishment. If discipline was in order, they were banned from watching movies. They were banished to bed immediately following dinner. In some cases, the adults even invoked corporal punishment. That consequence is not practiced today, for the record. Era remembers, though, being spanked with hands or with switches across her legs, and she says she remembers it stinging, but the pain passed pretty fast.
Right. So for better or for worse, there were always kids around at the Children's Home of York, and R wrote that us kids did have fights, but it was always nice to have a bunch of kids to play with, and they befriended other kids that didn't even go to the York home, and those were kids from York High, so they're neighbors, so they had to actually go out into the community and play with other kids as well.
Yep. We went last night to a volleyball league.
Oh, fun.
And since my 2-year-old is not in daycare and he's at home, I'm always worried that he's going to be the weird kid.
Doesn't have a social interaction.
Right, but so far so good. He was like playing with the other kids and having fun. And so we try to make him, so he has social interaction, isn't the weird kid. Yep. So not all children at the time remember their time so fondly.
Right.
In Mary Sittler Cooper's diary, remember she was the director that was there for 45 years. She writes that boys labored on nearby farms or as cobblers or shoe repair, that girls toiled in houses by doing laundry, sewing, cleaning, or doing housework. She compared it to a Charles Dickens novel. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see here. Oh yeah, so Mary, like I said, she was there for 45 years. I mean, that's nearly half a century. And so she worked diligently to try to change it from an institutional feel to more like a family feel. And so this idea of like a private home, like feeling comforting. So she got rid of the drab clothing and rid of the uniform haircuts as well.
And we don't want you to get the idea that the original trustees and the managers wanted the kids for enslaved labor. That is not what they were trying to do. So, today the practices would have violated the child labor laws, and we're not condoning it, but the intent of it was to teach the kids useful life skills. So a legal document spelled out the conditions of the placement, and it required the host families to provide good food, including meat, apparel, and they had to make sure that they were clean with regular baths. And the board of managers would go and they'd monitor the conditions. So they visited the home semi-annually in the rural areas of the county to see for themselves that the children were being taken care of and that the contracts were being honored. So this wasn't, here's a kid, they're going to clean your house for you and do your yard work, and we're never going to check on them.
You had to raise them like
you had to treat them like they were your own child.
Yep. Let me go back a second. So at the end of the apprenticeship, the families agreed to give each kid a fixed sum of money. And at the time, it was about $25, and this was in the year about 1900. Today, that would be about $1,000.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of cool. It reminds me of, we did a story on William Goodrich and how when people, when he was released from bondage, he was a man who was enslaved here in York County. and William Goodridge. And when he was released, they gave him a suit and a Bible. And they said, here you go. Like, here's where you get started.
Just go off into the world.
Yeah. Or even Milton Hershey School, where I taught for a number of years, the deed of trust originally said that they get the suit, the Bible, and $100 to, like, start their life. Give them something to get started. They also had to give them 2 outfits, like we said, and one of them had to be brand new, and this apprenticeship program lasted into the 1940s.
So it seemed really sterile and disconnected to describe the nature of these relationships, because they really should have ended up feeling like family after you live with someone for long enough. But the Children's Home made it clear of that expectation, that the families had to treat the children as their own. And they had to send them to school, they had to take them to religious services, and they had to provide recreation for them. So it couldn't be all work and no play. So we're sure that not every placement felt like home to these kids, but the Children's Home of York did make the best of it, and they really wanted to make sure that the kids were treated properly.
Conditions at the home changed over time, like we've already said. It went to be way more child-focused, but we want to point out that it didn't matter if the walls were painted with gold and they got chocolate cake every night for dinner. At the end of the day, these kids still remembered why they were here, and that was because they didn't have parents. So that was kind of like a black cloud that always hung over them. Era described the rise and fall of hopes for adoption when families came in. She said that they would look us over, in her words. And she said this without an ounce of self-pity.
Right.
She always spoke super highly of Troy. And she also said that the younger children were usually chosen first.
Oh.
I know.
But on a little lighter note, Santa never skipped coming to the Children's Home of York. So here's Rick Martin's grandfather's Santa costume on display at the recent anniversary party for the Children's Home of York. His grandfather was William Casper Laux, and he played Santa, and he gave gifts to the excited children on Christmas morning. And then we have a photo of another Santa that visited in 1923. So Santa always made sure that the kids were never forgotten, and then they got a little Christmas magic, which I think is really nice, and I think that's, really helpful, especially to a kid's psyche, to know that they're not forgotten and that they're loved.
So they could just remember all those special moments.
Everyone needs Christmas.
So remember, back to Era, that she found herself in the Children's Home of York at just 2 years old, which again is the same age as my son, so it's just like kind of hits home a little bit. And she waited there for 16 years. She was there for 16 years.
Yeah.
It wasn't until she was 18 that she found her own loving home, and that was again because of Mary Sittler Cooper. She drove her to the home of her new family, and from the outside, the cottage she described was like any girl's dream. She described it as a white house with a picket fence. She apparently looked through the window and saw a girl reading a book, and there was a long-haired cat that sat on the arm of the chair. She said it felt safe right away, and she knew that that was the home for her.
Oh, she ended up joining the family of the Beckers, and H. Robert was a veterinarian, and he lived there with his wife Frida, and they had a daughter named Betsy, so she had a sister. And they were her family for 4 years until Ara ended up marrying Theodore Franklin Arnold, and they ended up being married for 67 years. So she did find her family. She did.
Her obituary read, "She always had nothing but the fondest of memories and experiences of the children's home, being grateful for the home life she was given, which she instilled upon her children to be content and grateful for what they have in their lives." How do you raise not spoiled kids? Like, if you know the answer, please let me know. I'm trying to figure that out.
I'm a dog mom and a cat mom, and they're spoiled. So I can't give you no advice.
I feel like I've said this before, but parenting was so much easier before I had kids. Like, in my head, I was like, oh yeah, this is how I'm gonna do it. And then you have kids, and you're like, oh.
You got to practice on the cat.
That's true. Yeah, my Phoebe. She even requested in her obituary that all contributions that people wanted to give them would go to the Children's Home of York.
That goes to show, it was
a
good thing in her life. Yep. Yeah. So oftentimes the staff at the Children's Home of York would end up opening the doors to find kids just sitting on the doorstep. And the children would say, "I've come to live with you." And their, tiny little possessions would be packed in a small bag beside them. I mean, I couldn't imagine opening a door and a child being abandoned there. So think about the people that raised Era and the huge heart that they had to take this child that really had no one and nothing and say, "No, you're our child now, and we're going to treat you as our own and love you." So you have to have a really big heart. That's a commitment. That's a lifetime commitment.
And still today, I mean, the selflessness. And I mean, I know that some people can get empathy fatigue, right? Because you're constantly caring, but when I told people that I was doing a story on this, it was actually funny. We did a tour a couple of weeks ago, and I sent it to a bunch of my network. I don't know if you want to join. And they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm on the board. And I'm like, "Oh, you guys already know the Children's Home
6
of York."
degrees of separation in York. Everybody knows each other.
Yeah, but specifically they're giving themselves.
That's awesome.
Sort of volunteerism. There are a lot of volunteers that help out, but they're always looking for more. So please contact them if you would like more.
Never enough volunteers. We're learning.
So let's jump forward then into the 1960s and 70s, where we talk about the Reformation. So just like the 1860s, the 1960s is also going to see a lot of transformation. The civil rights movement was happening, and if you pair this with Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society, they took a second look at our social institutions, including Troy. So Ron Boone, he's the president and CEO of the Children's Home today. He gave us some insights, which you can read more on our website called Witnessing York. Jim wrote an amazing article on it. So if you just go to witnessingyyork.com, you can read it. And then we're also going to interview him and Terry afterwards to hear more of their firsthand perspective as what's going on here today.
Yeah, absolutely. So child welfare ended up switching from institutional thinking in favor of foster care and small group homes. So this is one of the many reasons that we never really hear the term orphanages anymore. So child development research found that family-like settings mimicked the nature and stability required for healthy emotional and social development. So, think about being paired with a mom and a dad and a sibling as opposed to being kept in this large home with a bunch of other orphans. So in 1969, the Children's Home opened its first group home, and it was large orphanages failed to meet the needs of the individuals, so sometimes causing emotional neglect and developmental delays. So these smaller homes ended up meeting the needs much better.
And they still use a lot of that practices today.
Yes.
So we want to point out that the original Children's Home didn't accept kids of color. If you look at the original bylaws, it said white children. And this, again, was not uncommon. Milton Hershey School was the exact same way. They just accept white kids. And we want to be careful of presentism. That, yes, it was totally wrong. Yes, it was racist. Absolutely. But we can't project current day values on things that happened 160 years ago.
Right.
What matters is that in the 1950s, that's when they took a second look at their bylaws. So there are minutes that reflect discussions about abolishing segregation to, again, catch up with the times and serve more deserving children.
Right. So by 1963, the revised Constitution and bylaws finally did just that, and they admitted their first black child, a 13-year-old girl, to the home. So if you look at the mural that's on South George Street, it was created in the 2000s, and it shows this change with white children on the left transitioning to more diversity on the right. Yeah. So I think that's a great way to illustrate the change over time.
It's a cool mural because it recognizes our history, but then also the intentionality behind it, changing that, so it's more just. So unfortunately, we had some questions on Facebook about the original Children's Home. It is not still standing today. It was demolished in 1973. The administrator estimated that more than 3,000 kids had passed through the doors. And to put it in perspective, Jim McClure made the comparison to West York School District. They have about 3,000 students at West.
That's a lot of children.
At West York. So that's about how many kids went through it to kind of try to conceptualize it. The remnants are still there today, though. If you go and look on the brick facade of that shopping center I showed you earlier, you can go and see there's a plaque that designates the spot so we don't forget. A few years later then, an emergency shelter was built on Shoe House Road in East York to replace the old home, and it's continued to grow to a campus-like feel, and that's where we're at tonight, and you can kind of see just how immense it is.
Yeah, so today they offer a variety of services that stays true to their mission of supporting the children in York County. So they provide foster care and adoption services, as well as residential living options for children requiring a more immersive experience, and that can help with past traumas. So what excites us the most is the work on preemptive services like building pro-social behaviors, and their curricula addresses the root causes of violence, delinquency, and dependency.
I was really impressed in the tour of the classroom. The classroom has, I don't know what I was expecting, but it's like homey. There's like things on the walls, and there's like art, and every kid has their desk, and it's very...
I think it's hard when you go into a place like this to know what to expect. Unless you've had to live that experience yourself, or you've had to work in a place like that. So I think it's a good thing that, it met your expectations and went above and beyond.
We went from like Charles Dickens novel of like, please, some more porridge,
Yeah.
sir, to like now. Now,
Yeah.
again, it is still a nonprofit. It is not like these kids are living like super lavish lives, right? But they're at least recognizing them as human beings and as kids that
Well,
we
and it's
love.
nice to know that they're actually being cared for.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So to then wrap up here, we took you through 160-year history in just under half an hour.
I'm impressed.
So let's go over our takeaways of things that we want you to remember from today's presentation. One is that the Children's Home of York was one of the earliest social institutions in York County that helped our kids. The second is that a lot of people in York County will probably never find themselves needing social institutions like this, and we can consider ourselves pretty privileged, right? But for the rest of the community, the unhealthy, the poor, orphans that are still around today, they need social institutions like this, and we need to continue to support human services because it makes our entire community healthier and safer. And then finally, the people who founded this, if you remember, it was just a man and woman that said, man, we made a lot of money with businesses. How can we give this back to the community?
Yeah, exactly.
So it was really built on the back of philanthropy and goodwill and wanting to help other people. But remember, though, too, people who are watching this, there's three ways that you can be philanthropic. You can give your treasure, for sure, but you can also give your time and your talents. And so your time is volunteering and showing up, and it sounds like I'm being a little egotistical now, or your talent, like Dami and I, doing this presentation, just trying to highlight it and bring a better light just by building this podcast and using our history skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want you to hang on because we're going to have an extra episode in about 10 minutes, but our next full episode is going to be on March 30th, If These Walls Could Talk, the Valencia. So this is actually a ticketed program, so if you go on the York History Center's website, you can get a ticket for that. It's not going to be a live streamed episode because it is a ticketed event. So if you want to watch that episode, you're going to actually have to buy a ticket and attend.
And it's all for a fundraiser for the history.
Yes, it's a fundraiser, so, you know, I know you have to pay money for it, but it's for a good cause. I think we're worth the price of admission.
And I'm super excited by this. I was in the archives yesterday digging through, like, the research of the Valencia. There's some cool stories.
Yeah, and some of the comments that have just been coming up on Facebook with people talking about all of their memories and having prom there.
Oh.
You know, it's been nice to reminisce with people. So, March 30th at the Valencia.
Yeah. Well, thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
See you in a few minutes.